Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Cleveland State University, Robert Conrad, and the Payne Fund.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Matt Zone, Councilman for Ward 15 and Chair of City Council's Public Safety Committee, and also a proud member of the City Club. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Matthew Barge, Partner and Executive Director of the Police Assessment Resource Center, also known as PARC. Mr. Barge is the lead federal court-appointed monitor overseeing the Cleveland Consent Decree. It's crucial to review some history first. In May of 2015, the U.S. Department of Justice announced the agreement to negotiate a consent decree with the City of Cleveland designed to dramatically improve and reform relationships between the police departments and the communities they serve. This decree resulted from investigations and findings from an event in 2012, a high-speed chase and deadly shooting of two unarmed people, Timothy Russell and Melissa Williams. The timing of those findings were released about 18 months ago, and for many, that timing and the findings themselves connected the consent decree to the November 2014 shooting death of 12-year-old Tamir Rice, a shooting that, in 2015, was deemed reasonable by two experts contracted by the county's prosecutor's office. All of this is important context to understand how the community perceives the consent decree and itself and their relationship to the police. Part of the consent decree included the establishment of the Cleveland Community Police Commission, a 13-member group dedicated to developing and making recommendations for comprehensive police reform. Several commission members addressed the City Club last year as the work was just beginning. And now that a year has passed, Mr. Barge is here to share updates on the progress and reflect on what still needs to be done in regards to implementing the consent decree. Matthew Barge was chosen as the federal court-appointed monitor overseeing the Cleveland Consent Decree in October of 2015. In his role, he leads a 15-member team of national experts and community members to track progress and offer guidance on community engagement, community-oriented policing, the use of force, and crisis intervention. In addition to the work in Cleveland, Mr. Barge is also currently serving as the lead police practices expert to a retired magistrate judge overseeing an agreement between the City of Chicago and the American Civil Liberties Union, addressing issues related to stop and frisk. Over his more than 10 years of affiliation with PARC, Mr. Barge has engaged in monitoring and assessment projects for multiple cities, including Mesa, Arizona, Los Angeles and Pasadena, California, Denver, Colorado, among some others. He and PARC have conducted reviews of high-profile use of force incidents for the University of California, Los Angeles, and the Los Angeles Unified School District, and made recommendations for improving policies and procedure. A lawyer, Mr. Barge previously worked as a litigator, specializing in complex, multi-district litigation at various law firms in New York City. He holds a JD from NYU School of Law and a graduate of Georgetown University with a bachelor's degree in political science and government. Ladies and gentlemen, members and friends of the City Club of Cleveland, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Matthew Barge.
Thanks, Matt, and thank you to the City Club and all of you for coming here today. As Matt said, I'm Matthew Barge. No one really calls me Mr. Barge, so please call me Matthew. I'm the co-executive director of the Police Assessment Resource Center, and as Matt was detailing, the Police Assessment Resource Center has been around since 2001. We're a nonprofit organization that's dedicated to providing consulting and independent monitoring for local police agencies and communities around the country. Here in Cleveland, we have a monitoring team now of 20 folks who I can't speak more highly of. They are national experts across various fields. We have 5 former law enforcement folks who have served as leads of and executives of local law enforcement agencies. We have experts in police psychology and organizational behavior and crisis intervention. The host of issues that Cleveland is facing are covered by those experts. And we have 4 folks from right here in Cleveland who have grown up here, who live here, who work here, and are part of Cleveland's diverse communities and are assisting in ensuring that we include the community at every stage of what we're doing. And I'll detail a little bit more about that as we go along. Matt covered, I think, sufficiently the context and the background for where we are. There was an investigation conducted by the Department of Justice, which does not go into those investigations lightly. They conducted an investigation and they found that the Cleveland Division of Police had engaged in a pattern and a practice of unconstitutional policing. The city and the Department of Justice agreed to make a series of reforms to address those issues, and to oversee that, they placed Judge Solomon Oliver on the federal district bench to oversee that. Judge Oliver, as many of you know, is a busy guy with a full caseload, and this is a lot of work. And so he approved, and the parties approved, of naming an independent monitor to oversee the work, and I was named as the monitor, with this monitoring team named as the team to support the effort. So we are an agent of the federal court. We are not part of the police department. We are not a part of the city. We're not a part of the Department of Justice. We are an agent of the court, and we have a fiduciary duty to the judge. As a lawyer, I take that really seriously, and everyone on the team does as well, which means that we aid and assist and serve as the eyes and the ears for the court, but that ultimately the federal court serves as a backstop to guarantee that the sort of things that the city and the Department of Justice agreed to are implemented. In that capacity, we adopt a few particular roles. One, and probably the most important, is as facilitator. The consent decree is a long, dense document, and it entails a lot of fundamental and foundational change for the Division of Police. And if the city or the Division of Police attempted to do all of it at once, none of it would get done well. And so part of our job is to come up with a framework and a process and a plan that allows the police department, the city, the police unions, the Community Police Commission, rank and file officers, members of the Department of Justice, everyone who has an interest in police reform in Cleveland, to try to understand what issues are happening on a day in and day out basis so that all can be involved as we work through them. As we work through those issues, we also provide a heck of a lot of technical assistance. We have a lot of experience in doing this with other places, so we do not sit back and watch as efforts are made that aren't quite good enough. We tell folks in real time what is expected and try to hold people accountable well before a lot of time is wasted, because given the comprehensiveness of the consent decree and the urgency of the issues, we don't have that kind of time to waste. Ultimately, we also help the judge serve as an arbiter. We will recommend to him whether various reforms are good enough and whether they satisfy the terms and conditions of the consent decree. The ultimate goal of the consent decree is simply to ensure that policing in Cleveland is effective, that it's safe for officers in the community, and it's constitutional, and consistent with the values of the Cleveland community across all of Cleveland's diverse communities. That is a simple mission, but a very tough thing to implement. And so we strive to run things through those interests, which sometimes it can be challenging to figure out how to accommodate in each and every instance. I'm going to go through some major areas that we have worked on so far and where we are starting to see some progress, and where I think the community will start to see some progress soon as well. One is with respect to the core issue of use of force. The consent decree was fairly unambiguous that force-related issues are front and center for what we're doing here. And so we have spent much of this year working with the Division of Police, the Department of Justice, and out in the open with the community about new force policies for the Division of Police, new rules of the road for officers that make expectations about when force is used as clear as possible. Those force policies are still being worked on to accommodate what I think it was a rather remarkable and in the open kind of community participation process. In which the Community Police Commission assisted on the front end in gathering input and values and experiences from Cleveland's communities and told us as a reform process and the Division of Police what it wanted to see in new force policies. The division then worked on them, and when they had worked on them up to a level that we felt was within the ballpark, those policies became public for everyone in Cleveland to read, review, and comment on. Provide comment on our website. There were multiple forums that were hosted by the monitoring team, and the Community Police Commission also participated in a significant way, offering their own recommendations and hearing additional input from the community. That has never been done in a consent decree in any other jurisdiction in the country. It's consistent with my commitment to doing this process as much as possible in the open so that people can see what is going on. Reform doesn't happen in nice closed rooms in a nice building here in downtown Cleveland. It needs to happen with and in partnership the community. Some of the documents that we are throwing out into the community, including the use of force policy, are very dense and very technical. And so we're also trying to, when we put these major elements of reform out in the public, that we provide as much as possible an opportunity for explanation, an opportunity for education, so that individuals, regardless of their pre-existing understanding of police tactics or procedure, can follow along. This is also all in service of policies that are clear. One of the problems with the Division of Police's old policies is that they were a muddled mess. They were very long, they were not well organized, and it was not clear, I think, to anyone exactly, precisely what officers were instructed to do in particular types of circumstances. So we have endeavored to make the policies and work with the division to make the policies as clear as possible. Along those lines, we've had substantial assistance from several folks on our team, not the least of which is Commissioner Chuck Ramsey, who's seated here with us today. He's the deputy monitor on this effort, former head of the police organizations in Washington, D.C. and in Philadelphia, and one of the heads of the President Obama's 21st Century Task Force on Policing, which has been heralded as providing a template for police reform, and working closely, Chuck and I and many others, with the division and with the community. We have the use of force policies about ready to be in a condition that can start to be implemented across the city. That is a big deal, and I think a foundational change in Cleveland, because it sets forth essentially that force must be used only when it is necessary, when it is proportional, when it's reasonable, and only after, if there are safe and feasible de-escalation techniques, those techniques have been used and exhausted. You can find a lot more information on the policies on which we are still taking comment on the monitoring team's website, which is clevelandpolicemonitor.com. Another area that we spent a lot of time and attention on of late is in the area of crisis intervention. We know that there are some individuals in our communities that are the subjects of force at disproportional rates. One of those groups are individuals who are experiencing what in clinical literature is increasingly called behavioral crisis. They're experiencing mental health issues, substance abuse issues, other long-term behavioral health challenges, and creating not only systems and processes, but training that for all officers to start to understand what specific responses may be called for them to use when they are dealing with particular types of individuals, and providing a specialized cadre of highly trained specialist officers who receive even more training, and getting those officers dispatched to the scene of incidents that involve people in crisis. These are the types of things that we're working on, and that too is happening part and parcel with community participation and input. In that instance, it really is the community that has been responsible for driving the changes in policy and training that are going to be implemented very soon. Along those lines, Bill Denahan, who's the head of the Adams Board here in Cuyahoga County, has been instrumental in partnering with the city and with social service providers from across the city, clinicians and psychologists and folks who actually work day in and day out with individuals experiencing behavioral health crises to try to get policies and training in place that actually, are informed by not just academic literature, but the real world, day-to-day way that the systems are and are not working for individuals with those challenges. Also here is Dr. Randy DuPont from the monitoring team, who has led our efforts in that area. Dr. DuPont really, I joke with him, is the godfather of crisis intervention. He is the leading figure in this area, and we are pleased to have him helping Cleveland to implement new ways for police officers to use different approaches to addressing individuals who are experiencing special types of challenges. A third area that we are working on is one that is especially important, and that relates to accountability and civilian oversight. As many of you know, for many years, the City of Cleveland has had an Office of Professional Standards that investigates complaints that residents make about Division of Police officers. Those investigations have been reviewed by what's called the Police Review Board, a board made up of citizens, of residents of Cleveland, who evaluate those investigations and make recommendations to the chief of police on how that investigation may or may not lead to discipline. Those entities have not worked well for Cleveland. They are, to be candid, a mess. And we have needed to go in and to change those structures and those processes from the ground up as though they were new entities and organizations. On paper, Cleveland should be a paragon of civilian oversight. In practice, it has a long way to go. And so we have been partnering very closely with those entities to, for the first time, and you need to wrap your heads around this a bit, for the first time have codified procedures and practices for how those entities do work. There's nothing written down about what those entities should do and perform their functions. Nothing written down, no expectations to grade people's performance against. There simply was nothing. And the consent decree provides us with an opportunity to make those entities professional and effective. For a bunch of reasons, citizen oversight is important, and the fact that they're civilians provides an important check on the department and provides a place where residents who are skeptical of the police department's ability to address their concerns can go. But also, those investigations can lead to ramifications, employment ramifications for officers. And officers deserve the knowledge that they are receiving a fair shake and that the investigation that is leading to discipline was fair and thorough and unbiased and correct. And so, there's a long way to go in getting there and assuring everyone that all of that is in place. But we have definitively spent significant time and resources to start that effort. And very soon there will be new processes, manuals that go into great detail about how those entities should function. And we have partnered with the Community Police Commission and others about what that should look like. Those are just a few areas. The consent decree is broad and comprehensive and reaches into a host of core operational and departmental functions. There's some areas that we're turning to very soon, and one of them I think is the most foundational, and it relates to implementing what the consent decree requires, which is a community and problem-oriented policing plan. This means that Cleveland, all of Cleveland, headed by the city and the Division of Police, need to talk and determine in a definitive way what policing looks like going forward across the city, and how policing happens in collaboration and partnership with the community. This needs to become a core operational philosophy, not an extracurricular activity. Pancake breakfasts and sending officers to work out in gyms or play basketball is nice, but community oriented policing and problem-oriented policing means just that, partnering with the community and working with the community to solve problems. Everyone is committed to that, is the irony. You talk to police officers and elected officials and anyone within the city. It seems like everyone agrees that there needs to be more opportunity for officers to engage, to listen, and to solve problems. And if everyone agrees on that, I think that that's a platform where we can start to get very specific about what that looks like in Cleveland. And our process is going to start to do that. Another thing that's going to aid us in that, and I think aid us in a substantial way, is the presence of the Community Police Commission. This is a group that was created by the consent decree to serve as a conduit between the community and the reform process. The Police Commission to date has participated in significant ways, not only in driving the public discourse and providing an opportunity, a forum for individuals from across Cleveland to say what they need to say about these issues related to police, but they've also provided written recommendations that are clear and have guided the discussions that have been had within the police department and outside. And I think it is setting a very good precedent for how residents, like they can in so many areas of public life, can have a say in the rules of the road that police officers operate under. From time to time in Cleveland, there is public discourse and controversy about who is speaking for the community on these issues and who really is the community on these issues. And people seem to want to argue that some groups or some voices are authentic and others are not, or some are more representative of the community than others. We hear that a lot, but in this line of work and under the consent decree, we all recognize on the monitoring team that democratic participation is a pretty old problem. There's smart guys like Socrates and Plato who had a lot to say about this stuff, and they couldn't quite figure it out either. Rather than sort of try to determine with definitive accuracy who really speaks for the community, the solution in this process is to provide avenues for people to give voice to their concerns and their experiences and their values and their history. That doesn't mean that we're going to be able to accommodate in every policy or every reform precisely what everyone wants to have happen with these issues or the police in Cleveland. That's impossible. But we are committing to providing everyone with the opportunity and the voice and the process to say what they need to say and to have their voices heard. And the Community Police Commission, along with elected officials and the monitoring team itself, is committed to making sure that that happens. Within the police department, something that we're working on closely and we're working on in partnership with elected officials and with the division is addressing the needs of individual police officers. We go out and spend lots of time with rank and file patrol officers, and it's clear that police officers are in need of more support. Some of this stuff is stuff. It is additional equipment and technology. It's additional training that provides them with the skill sets they need to police in Cleveland. And it's also providing officers with greater opportunities for career and leadership development. It's also, however, creating processes and systems and expectations within the police department that create what I usually refer to as a sense of internal procedural justice. Many of you may have heard the term procedural justice in the context of policing. It is a mechanism, a concept that police officers can apply in interactions with the community in which the goal is to always explain what and why the police officer is doing, so that even if an individual doesn't like the outcome, they are treated with respect, they know the expectations going in, and they understand why something happened to them vis-a-vis the police. Cleveland needs to give its police officers inside the department the same sense of procedural justice. They need to know what's expected of them, what happens when they screw up, and be held accountable if and when that happens in a fair, objective, and transparent way. So we will get very shortly into issues related to internal discipline, internal accountability, and that will be driving what we are doing in those areas. A final thing I will say is that throughout the consent decree process, there are defined goals that we need to meet and defined ways that we need to measure whether we're meeting those goals. And a challenge over time will be for everyone in Cleveland to come together and to commit to transforming the way that police work and the way that police and the community partner. It requires some initial, even if it's just half a step, slightly in a different direction on behalf of the police department and on behalf of the community. We are trying to provide a context and a process for folks from across Cleveland to engage substantively in what we're doing. But it really only works if everyone comes together with a will and a capacity to listen and to engage substantively, not just on what has happened in the past, which informs the present and must be part of that discussion, but in a way that also pivots toward how we are going to address it to ensure that the future does not resemble the past or the present. A few concluding remarks, and then I welcome as many of your questions as we can take. I'm very optimistic that despite the significant scope of work that we are charged with overseeing and the significant reforms that the police department needs to undertake, I'm very optimistic that Cleveland can and will become a model of policing in this country in several years. I think that there is a police department and a police leadership that is ready to take this on. We haven't gone through the period of outward resistance that has greeted these efforts in other places, and that's a testament to the mayor and the police chief and others that are working on this day in and day out within the department. I'm also optimistic because we are having individuals, many of you I see here today, who are coming out and being involved and making your voices heard, so that this is an opportunity that the community is taking us up on. I will also say that what I just described, I think anyone involved in the process really could detail for you what we're working on, what's going well, and where the challenges are. Ultimately, this monitoring team is charged with serving, as I started my remarks by talking about, we're charged with being the eyes and ears of the court. We are an independent entity. And the reason I bring that up is that we're not running for anything. Matt gets the pleasure of doing that in Cleveland. We're not running for anything. We are here entirely to see that this thing is implemented fully, fairly, and effectively. We really don't care who the elected officials that you send us are. We're going to work with them to make sure that this is implemented as effectively as possible. And so as we are conducting our day-to-day efforts, we want you to know that we take very seriously our position as an agent of the court and as an independent arbiter, and that we will work with absolutely anyone and everyone who wants to participate in this process with us. With that, I challenge all of you who have shown up here today, everyone listening, everyone watching, to become as involved in this process as you can. This only works if people participate within the community, within the police department, and across Cleveland's diverse communities. There are opportunities that the monitoring team has to interface with community organizations and have forums across Cleveland. We invite you to those. We strongly urge you to attend a community police commission meeting, a district policing council meeting, to talk to your city council folks, to make your voices heard on our website. There are a host of ways that individual citizens and residents can become involved in this process. And we urge as many of you as can to participate with us in the reform process. The final thing I will say to you is there's a lot of work to be done. And that gives us an incredible sense of urgency. We've been here for a year, and that has flown by. And so we are going to continue that sense of urgency to get as much done as quickly as we possibly can, because we know that many things need to change very quickly for the men and women, the police force, and the community. But I'll also say that the flip side of that is that real change is not a fast process. It has to get to the roots of issues and to plant something in its place. And there is some patience that I understand many communities across Cleveland remain skeptical of giving the process and of giving us. But I really do ask all of you, to the extent that you are able to give this process some time to see day in and day out the results on the streets of Cleveland, so that policing can be safe and effective and constitutional for everyone in the city. Thank you again to the City Club for the opportunity to speak here, and I'm really looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Today, we are enjoying a Friday Forum with Matthew Barge, Partner and Executive Director of the Police Assessment Resource Center. We're about to begin the audience Q&A. We welcome questions from everyone, City Club members, guests, students, and those of you who are just joining us via our radio broadcast, webcast, or our new live simulcast at the Parma Snow branch of the Cuyahoga County Public Library. If you'd like to tweet a question, please tweet it at the City Club. That's at the City Club, and our staff will try to work it into the program. We want to remind you that your questions should be brief and to the point, and actually be questions. Holding the microphones today are our content coordinator, Teddy Eisenberg, over here, and the Director of Programming, Stephanie Jansky, over here. May we have the first question?
You made a very interesting statement. You said everyone is connected to that, engaging with the community and solving problems. And we have a member of the Police Commission who has endorsed one of the presidential candidates who is spreading hate and dividing this nation. I've talked to a number of community members who, because this person is so visible on the news constantly, they are really beginning not to believe in the process. And it's a very serious problem. So my question to you is, how much power does this person have, and I'm sure you know who I'm talking about, to actually stop the process or keep us from moving forward? And how do you deal with that?
Thanks for the question. I get asked this with some regularity recently. And I will say this, the Police Commission was set up, and if you read the consent decree, in an effort to have many different and diverse communities represented on the commission. I am, as far as I know, the only individual who has the ability to interface with two police commissions. I remain doing some work on a similar consent decree in Seattle, which created the first, and Cleveland's the second. I will say that the Police Commission in Cleveland is remarkably diverse and has a remarkably diverse set of viewpoints. And I think that that is a good thing. It is not automatic that having police officers on the commission lead necessarily to some of the comments and rhetoric that people have a hard time with in Cleveland, because there are police officers on the commission in Seattle, and it's a different type of rhetoric. Ultimately, I think that the commission needs to ideally serve as a platform and a place where individuals who have views across the board can come together and talk about what needs to happen going forward. And the committee, the commission rather, was designed as a place to have that happen by saying that there need to be representatives from each of the three major police organizations. I don't know how those individuals are chosen or appointed, and the consent decree doesn't tell us. And so, unless or until such time that the consent decree tells us differently, we are trying to work with the commission as it's set up. But I will say that from my vantage point, I do expect that any person who is on the commission attends meetings regularly, participates fully, and makes their voices heard routinely. And to the extent that there's any individual who isn't living up to that end of the bargain, I think it's appropriate for the commission to be doing what they're doing now, which is to craft bylaws to try to bring to the attention of the city and the Department of Justice those instances where individuals aren't fulfilling their end of the bargain. It's a long way of saying I appreciate the concerns with respect to the one individual, but as I said before, the commission has done such good work in providing recommendations and influencing the process that I think that that individual does not have an outsized voice on the commission. And I think that that is appropriate given what that commission was created to do.
Mr. Barge.
Good afternoon.
Hi. The ultimate objective of your terrific work is excellent interaction between police officers and the citizenry. That's the measure of your entire endeavor. That's where the rubber hits the road. But measuring when that contact between a police officer and a citizen is a good one. Turns out to be, I learned from a presentation last weekend by someone from the Office of the Monitor of the New York Police Department consent decree. I learned that it's a tough question. It's a cutting-edge question. How do you measure good performance of that core task of the police department? Because if you can't measure it, how can you reward it?
That's an excellent question. Police departments historically collect information about arrests and core law enforcement activities. You know, crudely, how many people they throw in the back of their cars every day, and other related statistics. There does need to be a way, and we are going to implement metrics to try to get at, rather than how many people they interact with and send the way of the criminal justice system, how many problems they solve. It's tough because actually solving problems and directing people to social service providers and all of the sorts of things that are productive and worthwhile tend to take a little bit longer. So you can't really do it by volume. You can't necessarily really do it by quality. So it's, you know, it's sort of a kaleidoscopic kind of thing. There's no silver bullet approach or mechanism. But the fact that there's not currently really any good, reliable, systematic way that's tracked to gauge whether and how well officers are engaged with the community, solving problems and the like, is a problem. And we are going to, we are going to be informed not only by all the experts on the monitoring team, but other agencies in the country, which aren't many, but other agencies that have tried to do this. I'll be candid, I don't think there's one approach that has worked perfectly and is the best practice, but I don't think that that should stop us from trying to figure out in Cleveland what are the things that police officers really need to be doing and be incentivized to be doing, and again, in partnership with everybody involved, try to figure out the best ways of measuring that so that individual officers can be rewarded for that, the community can know about that, and that promotions and the like can take that into account as a core area to be considered.
Hi, Matthew. Good to see you again.
How are you?
Okay. We all know about 15 years ago the DOJ was here, and that was in 2002, and changes were recommended to the CPD then, 2004, and those recommendations were not implemented. My question is how can citizens be confident that this consent decree will be accompanied by definitive consequence that will be strictly enforced and are not overturned by the system of arbitration utilized by CPD?
Thank you for that question. I have two different responses, and don't let me forget to get to the arbitration piece. But with respect to the first about how this is different, DOJ did come in the early 2000s and recommend reforms. There's a key word you used, and I just word, which is recommend. That is an inherently voluntary process. This is not a voluntary process. The city has to do this. It's overseen by a federal judge for a reason. Federal judge has lifetime tenure, and this consent decree needs to be complied with, or the judge will still be enforcing it, and he has all of the powers and authority of the federal court. That said, Judge Oliver is a nice and reasonable guy, and on most days, I hope most people say that I'm a nice and reasonable guy. We're not trying to, hit everyone with sticks all the time. It's counterproductive. If you read anything about organizational change in any type of organization, simply trying to beat people into submission is not a way of changing culture for the long term. So despite the fact that we are here and we carry a certain stick, that is the federal court and its powers, a lot of what I just talked about with you was trying to involve as many stakeholders as possible from the ground up so that it's collaborative and individuals within the police department are participating day in and day out so that well after we're gone and this effort is gone, they built up the capacity inside the department to do this for themselves and to manage for themselves the risk of unconstitutional policing. That really is fundamentally how it's different. There was not a judge in charge as a backstop before, and now there is. And that independent voice has a say in how we're doing and how it's going. With respect to the arbitration process, there is nothing that we can do as the monitor to change employment law in the state of Ohio. What we can do is compel systems and processes within the city and the Division of Police to be as arbitration-proof as possible, to work with the city and the department to try to ensure that when they impose discipline, it is upheld by arbitrators. And I'm not sold that the systems and processes that the Division of Police has had in place to date always ensure that that's the case. So I will admit, we can only do so much, but what goes to arbitrators should be as solid of a case, as solid of an investigation, fair, thorough, accurate, using a process that's written down and codified that embodies the values and the interests of due process and due cause. Again, it will be a process to get the Division of Police there to ensure that that happens uniformly, but it just should never be the case that an arbitration is lost because of the process and because the process could have been better. And we are working closely with a lot of different folks on our team and within the city to allow that to happen. So bottom line, can't guarantee you because there's a limit to our authority and what we're doing, but within that, we are trying to make sure that it is as tough for an arbitrator to reverse a decision as it can be.
Hi, Matthew.
Hi.
Early on, you spoke about special training for officers who are responding to calls properly to handle maybe those who have special needs. Where are you in that process? What will it look like? And if you haven't started anything with it yet, is there a timetable for implementation?
So we are well underway in that. I mentioned briefly before, and I'll expound upon it now, this Mental Health Advisory Committee, again, created by the consent decree and led so far by the Division of Police itself in partnership with the Adams Board of Cuyahoga County. And it's 50-some-odd folks from across the social service network who have been participating with the police to craft policies on interacting with individuals who have mental health or behavioral health or substance abuse issues. And it really has been an out in the open collaborative type of process. Some things have been changing around slightly with deadlines, but by the end of the year, there will be some community forums on these policies, again, for everyone to take a look at out in the open. That committee is a public, and very diverse group. And so individuals from across Cleveland who want to get involved on what they're doing can use that entity to do so. That is, I think also one thing I'll say is that it is, I think, a really good innovation to have a group of experts from the community working on this stuff because they deal with these issues day in and day out, as well as individuals who have been in the past the recipients of these sorts of services to provide a first-person narrative, and I think that's important. And I think it may provide a model going forward well after the consent decree is done for ensuring that some of the challenges that we're facing and we're trying to reform now don't backslide. And so to the extent that more people want to become experts in these sorts of areas, it's something that I think could be very productive in the long term.
How well has progress been going in terms of reaching out to people to participate who have language barriers or questions about their citizenship status?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. We've gotten we got a lot of feedback in the community participation process on the use of force policies about needing to ensure that a lack of English proficiency or speaking another language as a first language is something that officers have instinctively as a factor that they base decision making on. That obviously someone's inability to understand commands in a situation may impact their ability to comply, and that trying to determine exactly what an individual's aptitude or proficiency when there's time and it's safe to do so under the circumstances, that be factored into. And I think that the community frankly told the process that we did that a little bit, but not as well as we should have. So we have beefed up the treatment of that concept in subsequent discussions and drafts of the policy. I think that we are cognizant on the monitoring team of the fact that there are communities and sub-communities in Cleveland who need our special attention in their native language. And so as we interact with community organizations and individuals in neighborhoods, we try to either take along one of our folks who has that aptitude and proficiency, or partner with organizations who can provide translation services and the like. Those are the major ways that those issues have surfaced so far in our process, and I suspect that there will be more as we go along. Hey there.
Matthew.
How are you?
Okay. My name is Marvin Patterson, and I am a Christian community activist. And as an activist, we get to hear a lot of the stories, individuals who may have suffered a wrong or what they believe is a wrong at the hands of the police officers. And every chance I get, I try to speak about Rebecca Whitby and her mom. It's been since 2009, they had a serious incident with the police, and it has not been resolved. The two of them have suffered greatly. So my hopes is, as you conform and as the policies are drafted, that you will take a clean look at what happened to this family. So I'm hoping the Office of Professional Standards will step up to the plate and help these individuals, because there is suffering that's going on out there. And I don't think individually we're really addressing it. We see on paper, there's policies, there's procedures, but these are people. So I'm hoping this is something, as we continue to move along, that you will address, which is the actual cases.
No, thank you for that. And we hear about those cases as we go around the community as well. The commitment that I can make to you is that really the first phase of this process is getting stuff down on paper. It's crucially important, but paper is relatively inexpensive to print. And it matters whether that paper, those policies, are fully and effectively implemented, which is what we have to certify to the court before this is over. So we will look at cases from across time to try to identify whether under these new policies, these processes, the procedures, that some of the things that folks are worried about within the department, outside the department, across Cleveland are addressed. So we're not, just because these policies will soon go to the court and hopefully be approved by us and by the court, that's just the first step, and that's just in force, right? And so there's a long process after that to ensuring that it translates into the day-to-day interactions that people have and across Cleveland.
That actually was what I was going to ask about. When is the consent decree declared over? And after that, what ensures transparency and citizen participation and continued training for officers after you've gone home and everybody here is left as we were?
So the answer to the second question is that you do. That's why you need to be involved in this process with us. We're gonna try to leave this city with as much in the way of good process and good systems, and leave the Division of Police with the training and the policies that it needs to succeed. But paper can be changed and culture can go sideways very quickly. We have too many examples of that, and I'm not even really speaking about the police. We just know that. And so part of what we're trying to do is to get in place not only systems and processes that have transparency and accountability and fairness for everyone at the core, but also to ensure that there is community participation and engagement in that. And that is part of why it's so important. That's why the commission is so important. It's why these civilian oversight mechanisms are so important. It's why having the police officer organizations involved along with the process has been so important, because over the course of this endeavor, everyone needs to be involved so that they understand what needs to be maintained after we leave. With respect to the duration, the consent decree contemplates 5 years. We are driving to meet that, and I don't see any reason why we can't do that. But again, it's up to the capacity of the division and the city as well as the participation of all of you with respect to how long we can do that. We are, as a monitoring team, I think, not only are we a group of folks who I think have done this work in other places and have, in many instances, worked in other police departments. As a nonprofit organization, PARC extracts certain commitments from the people we work with, and one of those is to provide pro bono work, so that we're not stopping just because we do get paid for this. The money has stopped. We simply keep working until until the job gets done. And I mean, that's our commitment from the beginning in Cleveland. And so I don't see with that as sort of a backstop and a bedrock why 5 years is impossible at all, but it really does rely on the ability for the division and the city itself, across the city, to participate and drive this forward.
Oh, my knees. Sorry. Mr. Barge, I appreciate your comments. The greatest measuring tool for the Black community is not living under the threat or fear of having every civilian police interaction resulting in a televised, state-sponsored, extrajudicial, taxpayer-funded homicide. To what extent have efforts been made to incorporate families, members of the deceased in the overall transformation that needs to happen with regard to changing police culture behavior? Thank you.
I mean, as I referenced earlier, and I'll just get a little bit more into, I mean, part of the reason that we have 4 folks from right here in Cleveland, Charles C., who's up here, and Tim Tramble, who's back there, is to make sure that we are always talking, across the community, including to people who have had family members affected by violence of all sorts, including the police, not including the police. I think that is just reflective of the larger commitment to try to incorporate as many voices into this as possible. I would say that the folks who are the most skeptical about the ability for change to happen in Cleveland really are those whose families have been affected the most. A lot of the conversations that I've had and we've had with folks who have experienced that, have really, I've simply had to ask them to hold tight and follow along with what we're doing, even if you don't want to participate now. Just don't completely, assume from the get-go without seeing at least some proof in the pudding, one way or the other, that this is doomed to failure. And so, with those folks, as well as with families who have had their loved ones who are police officers killed in the line of duty, across the spectrum, to join this process and tell us from their perspective what needs to happen, what needs to change, because everybody, I'm convinced, has something to bring to the table. And that really is part of that democratic participation that I was talking about. So we are trying to get into communities across Cleveland, and one thing I'd say to you, and I'd actually say to all of you, is that we're trying to get not just those of you who show up at the City Club or show up to your churches or show up to community organizations. I technically live in New York City. I never go to any community meetings. There are a lot of people like that in the city of Cleveland, as Matt and others know. We still want to hear from those folks, because those kinds of folks often are impacted by these issues the most. And to the extent that you can be helpful in getting any of us teamed up with, hooked up with, for a coffee, for a chat, for a visit, whatever it is, with anyone who's had any experience with the police or otherwise, we want to hear that, and we want to hear that in an ongoing kind of way. And so to the extent that there are specific people who we want to talk with them, and urge you to talk to me afterward if that's the case.
Mr. Barge, a quick comment and then a question.
Sure.
I serve as a labor arbitrator, among other things. I have never done a Cleveland police case. I'm a little disturbed by your comments that you want to see procedures put in place to make it far more difficult to overrule imposition of discipline. I've seen too many cases where the imposition of discipline was really the result of a supervisor's improper conduct himself, or covering his behind for what happened. This is going to be a very difficult question for you to deal with. However, my question really goes back to underlying attitudes. Police feel as they go into the various areas of town, they're scared to death. The resident population looks at the police as an occupying force. With the proposed changes you and your group are coming up with, and your work across the country, have you seen any evidence of a change in attitude of either the police as to their fear of going into communities, or a change in attitude of the community as to the role of the police?
Thank you for that question. You know, I would say that one of the things that is probably at the leading edge of police reform right now is providing police officers with training on implicit bias. And the reason I think that's so important is that we all have implicit bias. I have implicit bias. It's a fact. It's been researched in very controlled ways. We all carry certain associations between certain people and certain concepts, and it's culturally, it's just part of our culture. It's not escapable. And that training on that concept is so important because it does not go in presuming that police officers necessarily are committed to treating some people differently as an express value. In fact, I would obviously hope that anyone who has an express commitment to treating people differently based on the color of the skin or who they are is not on the police force or working in city government. But that doesn't necessarily mean that in fast-moving situations of the type that police officers need to encounter from time to time, it's very easy to have subconscious types of associations and experiences come into the decision making. Federal judges, state judges, teachers, doctors, other medical professionals receive training on implicit bias because it's been found to affect their behavior and their outcomes. Police officers are professionals just like all those other folks and should receive the same training. One of the interesting things about that training, again, this is very much backed up by literature, and it's a little unsatisfying, but it's kind of remarkable. The thing that changes behavior and attitudes about bias the most is going through training about implicit bias and understanding that simply having that top of mind is something that can change outcomes and change interactions. And so that's a part of what we're doing as we go and talk about the bias-free policing elements here. There's no city in the United States of America that has solved this issue entirely. Police officers are called on often to deal with individuals who the social service fabric has failed or left behind or left out. And they're also called to deal with social challenges that cut way across our culture, not just law enforcement. The challenge is that obviously police officers are at the front lines and have the ability and the discretion to use force, to deprive folks of liberty and the like. And we see the outcomes as being especially profound in some instances. So the stakes and the magnitude of the challenge is significant in law enforcement, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't at least some tools that are used by a number of other professions at this point to try to make outcomes fairer and more appropriate. That's a long way of saying I can't guarantee you that we're going to solve every last of those problems, but there are at least ways that have been used in many other departments across the country to try to get police officers the same type of conscious decision-making training that has been successful in other fields.
Today at the City Club, we've been enjoying a Friday forum with Matthew Barge, partner and executive director of the Police Assessment Resource Center. Our community partner for today's forum is the ACLU of Ohio. We appreciate your support and partnership. And that brings us to the end of today's forum. Thank you, Mr. Barge. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This forum is now adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.
Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Cleveland State University, Robert Conrad, and the Payne Fund.